Chapter 15 is special senses. So we'll get started right away by going through the basic topics. We're going to go through olfaction and gustation, which are chemical senses. So olfaction being your sense of smell and gustation being your sense of taste. We'll get into vision, where your eyes are obviously involved in capturing light and converting that into an image. Hearing, we detect sound waves. And then equilibrium, we are detecting motions of our head and then using that information to maintain balance and equilibrium. So let's begin just as an overview of where we're going. We're actually going to start with olfaction, which again is a chemical sense where there are certain chemicals that can enter your nasal cavity and get detected up here in what's known as the olfactory epithelium. Those chemicals stimulate neurons that eventually synapse and connect to neurons that are in the olfactory nerves, and that goes to your olfactory cortex of the cerebrum. Gustation uses taste buds, which contain the sensory neurons. Most of those taste buds are found throughout the tongue, but also in your throat, on your epiglottis. That's a chemical sense. And that sense requires three cranial nerves. If you recall, we use the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerve. Then we'll get into vision, and eyeballs are probably going to be the most complicated structures in this chapter, along with the structures for hearing and equilibrium. So we spend most of our time on vision, and then we finish up with hearing and equilibrium. So let's begin with our sense of smell. Again, this is a chemical sense. We're detecting chemicals called odorants. These odorants will enter your nasal cavity, and they have to reach the olfactory epithelium, which is only in this upper area of your nasal cavity. So you don't detect any chemicals anywhere else. So quite often, if we really want to smell something well, we want that air that contains the odorants to reach this upper surface of your nasal cavity. So we might sniff or waft the air up to reach that olfactory epithelium. So to understand what's going on there, we expand on that area and we have a thin layer of mucus. So there would be a mucus layer covering the epithelial tissue. The chemical would have to dissolve in that mucus and stimulate the olfactory receptor cells. So these here, these bipolar neurons, are the sensory neurons for your sense of smell, called olfactory receptor cells. So the chemicals dissolve, they stimulate the little cilia or olfactory hairs. Those are these little projections that stick off of the dendrite. That's going to trigger an action potential, and that travels along the axons. So notice then the axons have to go through the cribriform plate. Recall that the cribriform plate is part of the ethmoid bone. And that cribriform plate basically forms the ceiling of your nasal cavity. And just above that cribriform plate, there's your olfactory bulb of the olfactory nerve. So those axons have to get through that cribriform plate, so there's got to be holes for them. And if you remember, we learned those back in the bone chapter as well. Those are called olfactory foramen. Then those neurons will synapse or make connections with some other neurons that are found in the olfactory bulb. The olfactory tract then carries those axons of these neurons to the olfactory cortex of your cerebrum. And that's where you process and perceive this information. So that's your basic anatomy. This is the neuron path. So again, there's the olfactory receptor cells. These are the neurons of the olfactory tract. You'll notice that olfaction does not have to go to the thalamus to be relayed. These neurons will directly connect to this area known as the olfactory area of the cerebral cortex. And we can recall that that area of the brain is mostly found in the temporal lobe. You're also going to be utilizing some memory and intelligence in order to decipher those odors. Odors also activate parts of your limbic system. So sometimes certain smells will bring up certain emotions, pleasant emotions, maybe if it's a really good smell, or odors can also be unpleasurable. So that's your sense of smell, olfaction. Let's move right into gustation. So this is a view of a tongue, and you would not be able to see taste buds. They're not large enough to see with the naked eye, so you would have to use a microscope to identify and see an actual taste bud. But what you do see on the surface of the tongue are these papillae. And a papillae is a larger structure that may or may not house taste buds. There's actually 3 that do house taste buds. In the back of your tongue, you have what's known as the valate papilla. These, if you stick your tongue out and look in the back, you can see those at the back of your tongue. And then inside those structures, it would be lined with taste buds. So notice these taste buds are really, really tiny. The foliate papillae are on the sides of the tongue, so they kind of form little folds along the sides. And then the fungiform papilla, someone thought they looked like mushrooms, and they're kind of scattered throughout the surface of the tongue. So these are the larger structures that house taste buds. There's a 4th one called the filiform papillae, and those don't have taste buds, but they have tactile receptors. So those are used more for textures, because your sense of taste, although we call it a chemical sense, there's actually other senses that play a role. So there's some mechanical influence, so texture of food, temperature will influence how you taste things as well. And then in these 3, again, these are the 3 that have taste buds, you would find structures that look like this. And they're going to have the neurons. So here they call them just taste cells, but you can also call them gustatory receptor cells. So the chemical will stimulate those neurons. Those neurons produce action potentials that will travel either by the facial nerve, if it's more this anterior 2/3, glossopharyngeal, if it's the posterior 1/3, and then if those taste buds are, say, in your throat or on your epiglottis, they would travel via the vagus nerve. And then this kind of shows that neurological pathway, showing the 3 different cranial nerves, 7 being facial, 9 being glossopharyngeal, 10 being vagus. And those neurons, that pathway does go to the thalamus. So now we see it traveling to the thalamus, and then it gets relayed to the gustatory cortex, which is found in the insula lobe. So those are your chemical senses. Now, when it comes to taste, we got to spend a little more time kind of breaking down it a little further. So again, we've learned the cells. The neurons are gustatory receptor cells. The chemicals we call tastants. So like chemicals that you can smell are odorants. Chemicals that you can taste are tastants. We've got the 3 nerves, 3 cranial nerves. We've got the relay system, right? Relaying from the thalamus to the gustatory cortex. Hypothalamus is involved in limbic system. So hypothalamus, if you recall, one of its jobs is to make sure we're eating. So it kind of needs to be told, that there's food in our mouth, and, we are eating it. Limbic system, again, emotions, foods do activate parts of the limbic system. Then we have our major tastes, or what we call our primary tastes. Sugars are sweet, so monosaccharides, disaccharides give us our sense of sweetness. Acids are sour, So foods that have acids in them are going to taste sour. So citrus, for example, is acidic. Salty come from ions. Now the most obvious ones are sodium chloride, but other ions can activate your salty receptors. Bitter, there's a number of molecules that are bitter. There's a whole category called the alkaloids, but there's things in, say, coffee that taste bitter. A lot of poisons, environmental poisons, are actually bitter. So if you ever find yourself, lost in the woods, I wouldn't eat bitter berries because a lot of our poisons are bitter tasting. And then there's a fifth one called umami. Umami was identified by Japanese. It was found to be kind of this savory or flavor enhancing, or sometimes we call it meaty flavor. And it comes from an amino acid called glutamate. So foods that are rich in glutamate tend to have this savory flavor to it. So obviously, certain foods that have a lot of protein have this. Mushrooms are thought to be kind of savory because they're rich in glutamate. Obviously, red meat might have this savory. And once we discovered this, there was some researchers that synthesized glutamate and added it to food, and that is monosodium glutamate, or MSG, because it kind of enhanced the flavor of foods. The problem is glutamate can accumulate in the brain. So a lot of studies suggest that if you consume large amounts of this MSG, it might actually cause some brain problems because it could accumulate. What else plays a role? Temperature. So you got thermoreceptors will play a role. Certain foods might taste better warm or cold, and vice versa. So I always think of like soup. If you eat soup, you typically want it warm. I don't know anyone that opens up a can of soup and just drinks it right out of the can. Typically, you want to warm that up. And then other foods might taste better cold. Mechanoreceptors are for texture, so certain textures play a role. Again, some people would prefer foods that are crispy. So maybe they like their French fries crispy, or they like their apples crispy, as opposed to like mushy. So that plays a role. And then nociceptors are pain. You do have nociceptors, and that can play a role in how things taste. There's a chemical in peppers, capsaicin, which actually kind of plays a role as well. It activates pain, and so a lot of people like that in their food. They like really spicy foods. So your sense of taste is pretty complicated. It's got a lot of different types of receptor neurons that detect a lot of different types of chemicals. Your sense of smell even plays a big role. If you think about, congested sinuses and nasal cavity when you're sick, a lot of times you can't taste food very well because your sense of olfaction plays a huge role in your overall sense of taste. So those are our two chemical senses for special senses. We're going to start a brand new video and maybe just cover everything that has to do with your eyes and vision in one separate video.